Good morning, everyone. Hey, I just wanted to point out a couple things. One is, I think we can all agree that birth is really hardest on the husband. That's the one who really has to go through a lot. And Henry Dorn is here with us. That is unbelievable, Henry, that you're here this morning. We're grateful for your family. Nathan, if you're watching online, I'm joking. It's a joke. We're praying for you guys too. But it's pretty exciting. I've said this before, but we like to grow our church one way or the other, and so we're gonna. If it's babies, that's awesome. All right, so we are in a sermon series called Holy Sexuality, and some of you are like, "Wait a second, the scripture reading came up, but nobody went up, and it was a little confusing." Let me tell you something. I've been trying to figure out, who should I ask to read? Get up on stage and in front of a room full of their peers, read a scripture that references sex or sexuality. Not many people are interested in that. But worse, the people who are, I don't want to get up here and have them read it. So we've just been consigning the scripture reading to the actual sermon, but we'll get back to our normal programming. We are building on some ideas from last week, so if you weren't here or didn't listen, or if you're thinking, "Oh, Patrick, you didn't say this, or you didn't say that just right," I promise I said everything perfectly last week, so you have to go back and listen. I don't promise that, actually. I don't know. But I just want you to know we're not going to get into everything. We're building, and we can't go over everything. But just briefly, we talked last week about how sex positive the Bible actually is, Song of Solomon. We talked about how sexual brokenness affects all of us. And we talked about how with God, there's just unlimited redemption and healing. That's a good thing. The rapidly changing norms around sexuality are not a new thing. We tend to think like in our day and age, things are shifting so quickly we can't keep up. It's something new and different, but not really. In fact, some of the things that feel like they're still in flux have actually been entrenched in our culture for a while. For example, even though I'm a relatively young man, I did go to college nearly 30 years ago. And while I was in Bible college in small town, good old-fashioned home values, grandma and apple pie, rural America, even there were some norms that seemed pretty different than what you would expect. For example, I worked at this restaurant in this town, and one evening it was slow, and anytime you've had, almost any job, conversations turn to what are weekends plans, what's the activities, and this group of coworkers knew I went to Bible college, so they teased me constantly about being a prude and all that. If you've ever been in that position where everybody else was a lot more open and free than you were, you probably know what I'm talking about. And so they're talking about what they're going to do for this weekend, and they were talking about how they were going to get drunk and they were going to have fun with their boyfriends, girlfriends, that sort of thing. It's not how they said it, because that would be weird, but that's what they were talking about. And one of them, I'm kind of standing there, not really participating in the conversation, because I don't have anything to say. I'm a Bible college student. I'm unmarried. They kind of know already. And one of them turned to me and was like, "Patrick, really, truly, you are not going to have sex before you get married?" And I said, that's the plan. That's what's on the schedule for now. I didn't even have a girlfriend at the time. And they're like, "That's just crazy." And one of the coworkers said to me, he said, it just doesn't make any sense. You would never buy a car without test driving it first, would you? And I usually don't think of a good thing to say in the moment. I think of it 2 or 3 years later in the middle of the night. And I thought, if I had a time machine. But in the moment, I just remember, and I've just been proud of this response for like 30 years. In the moment, I said, "Listen, if I'm only ever going to drive one car, what does it matter?" Now, I know some of you are like, it's pretty good. I don't know if it's that good or not. I don't know if it made any difference or not. But it felt nice in the moment to be able to not feel like you were on the defensive about these topics, these issues. Because I feel like as Christians, we sometimes feel like we're just constantly on the defensive of trying to explain why we would hold these, what we think of as maybe old-fashioned, traditional, and what other people think of as regressive or archaic values around sexuality. But it's not just that. That was 30 years ago when the norms around living and sleeping together before you were married were already entrenched in society. That's just 30 years ago. If you rewind 600 years back to the days of Martin Luther, we have lots of his writings, lots of his thoughts, and he wrote about temptation, and he sort of went on this little rant about the whole idea. Now, Martin Luther, we think of him as a German philosopher, a German theologian rather, but he wasn't. He lived in the Holy Roman Empire. That's what it was known as at that point. So Martin Luther lived in a theocracy. Everybody around him lived in a theocracy, which means that culture and church were just one and the same. And even in that environment, Martin Luther looked around him and he said these words, nothing, talking about sexual norms, nothing is disgraceful anymore. He kind of sounds like an old man, meeting with the other old guys at the diner at 6 a.m. on Fridays. Nothing is disgraceful anymore. So 600 years ago, in a theocracy, people felt like sexual norms were changing too rapidly. If you rewind 1,000 years back to ancient Rome, it is impossible for me to describe to you how shocked you would be if we just spelled out some of the prevalent things that were happening in and among society. Things that even the most secular atheist would be horrified at were not just commonplace, but they were celebrated. They were enshrined in art and hung over the mantle. Things that we would send people to jail. Our culture, not just Christian culture, our culture at large would send people to prison for the remainder of their lives. If you think of names like Epstein and Weinstein, guys like that, things like that were happening constantly without remorse, without regard. That first century culture that was so different than ours is what the Bible speaks into, particularly the letters of Paul in the New Testament. I want to show you a couple verses starting in 1 Corinthians 6:18. We won't read all these, but I highlighted what I really wanted you to notice, where he talks about flee from, and then this phrase, this word, sexual immorality, or Galatians 5:19, the acts of the flesh are obvious. Among you there must not even be a hint of it. Or Colossians 3:5, where Paul writes, put to death. All this stuff, including this phrase, sexual immorality. 1 Thessalonians 4:3, it is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid this phrase, sexual immorality. They're very opposed to it, very opposed to whatever this is, but it's kind of a vague phrase. It's a vague idea that we could, if we're not careful, we could really populate with a lot of our own ideas, a lot of our own norms. We could impose upon the text, but we don't want to do that. We want to know, what does Paul have in mind when he uses that phrase? When we're talking about how we conduct ourselves with regard to sex and sexuality in the world, what are the authors of Scripture trying to communicate? What are they saying? What is sexual immorality? Now, the New Testament author Scott McKnight says that a Hebrew person, when they heard that phrase, it's a single Greek word, and when they heard that word, they would immediately rewind to their Hebrew Bibles. Remember, we read through the entire Pentateuch earlier this year. They would rewind to a specific chapter. It would call to mind a specific chapter in the book of Leviticus, chapter 18, where there is this super uncomfortable section where God outlines in this passage, basically, he's essentially saying, these are the people that are off limits. Engaging in sexual relations with these people, no good. It's very uncomfortable, and if you're reading the first 5 books of the Bible for your devotional time in the morning, you get to a passage like this, and you're like, what if I'm just going to kind of breeze through this because this is a tough one. Most of the boundaries are around who, and they have to do with things that are really uncomfortable to talk about or even think about, but things like incest and adultery along those lines. So it really had to do with these are the types of relationships you have to avoid. But by the time of Christ, this is super fascinating. Rabbis spent all day, every day, thinking about the Bible and trying to figure out exactly what does everything mean. And they compiled all that thought into this commentary. It's essentially a commentary of rabbinical thinking called the Talmud. And what they had done is they had just, every little word they had parsed out, and they had thought, we're trying to get an idea of what the whole thing means, and specifically what are the expectations of the followers of God with regard to their sexuality. And they had come up with 3 prohibitions in addition to Leviticus 18. So in addition to these people, they also said, hey, the boundaries are you cannot be unmarried, it cannot be unwilling, and it cannot be selfish. You cannot be married, it cannot be unwilling, and it cannot be selfish. So Leviticus really focused on the relationships, but the Talmud really focused on relational health. What was good and what was thoughtful, and how to actually love other humans. And so this is incredibly forward when you think about it, but the Bible or the rabbinical thought around the Bible said sexual activity had to be around the boundaries of commitment and consent and generosity. And if they didn't, if they included the wrong who, or outside the boundaries of commitment, consent, and generosity, that was sexual immorality. That was the basic definition. And it was well enough thought about that when they could just say the word and everybody had a general idea of what was being talked about. That's pretty forward thinking for 2,000 years ago. That's pretty on target. I think most people, not everybody, but most people, regardless of a relationship with Christ, would look at those 3 boundaries, commitment, consent, and generosity, and be like, yeah, that seems pretty good. I like that. That seems in keeping with what I think is good. It's pretty amazing. I did want to tell you this, as I'm reading through the commentary, the rabbinic commentary, they thought the more mutually enjoyable the sexual activity between husband and wife, the better the quality of children they had. So what kind of children do you have? What kind of parents are you? You can think like, oh, okay, all right. Now, I don't know, but that was their thought. Because it was supposed to be something that both parties found value and joy and flourishing and goodness in this. And so they had created these boundaries around it. Paul actually writes, we read it earlier in Galatians 5:19, he says the acts of the flesh, they're obvious. It's obvious. He's like, come on, use your brains. And he writes sexual immorality, impurity, and debauchery. It's obvious. Now some of you are like, I don't know that it's so obvious. I don't know that the norms that I grew up with or that I didn't grow up with are all that obvious. There is some deep confusion around what is sexual fulfillment and sexual immorality. A few years ago, I was driving in a state that did not require passengers in the back to wear seatbelts. And I tell you that because I was behind a car where some, I presume, high schoolers, maybe college-age guys, were climbing out of the sunroof at highway speeds and literally sitting on top of the car at highway speeds, and I was behind them. D-U-M-B, right? Now, it's interesting because I don't know. I kind of did a little research, but I'm not enough of a legal expert to know anything about it. I didn't see anything in that state's statutes about whether or not you could climb out of the sunroof of a car at highway speeds. I think a lot of people would be like, well, you're just going to get what's coming to you if you do dumb stuff like that. But I imagine, had there been a state trooper on the road, he would have pulled them over and probably given them a citation for what? What do you think? Reckless driving, right? Even though I hope it wasn't the driver doing that, although that would have been impressive. I think we all can agree with that. It would have been reckless driving regardless of the fact that there is no specific statute that says that's reckless driving. This is what Paul is saying. He's saying if you use your brains a little bit, you can figure out what sexual immorality is. You have to push past some red flags. You have to push past some discomfort to engage in behaviors that go against these boundaries, these good, healthy boundaries that God has set up. There's standard objections, especially in our society, but this is not limited to modern American society. This is probably modern Western society. You'll hear things like the Christian sexual ethic is repressive. You'll hear that. You'll hear monogamy is not realistic. Humans were not wired to be monogamous. You'll hear people say, well, look, the boundaries are as long as people are consenting, whatever, just it's fine. It's not our business. You'll hear, it's not harming anyone, so, who really cares? What does it really matter? A friend of mine discovered that they were epileptic because they had a seizure at a public library. That's when they realized, oh, I got a problem. While they were seizing, someone stole their laptop, wallet, and phone. Reprehensible, right? Send that person right to jail. Life sentence, right? It just, when you see some human taking advantage of another human who's vulnerable and in crisis, you're like, that is ugly behavior. That's no good. Is this really anything worse than one human taking advantage of another human that's vulnerable and needs help? No, right? I think we can all agree. Hold on to that emotional reaction you have. I want to show you a picture. We know who this is? Yeah. Anybody know her real name? Norma Jean Baker. There's some evidence actually that the Baker last name might not be correct. It might be Mortensen. But Norma Jean Baker Mortensen, Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe, she is literally the Western, she's called, when you open up the dictionary and you look in the dictionary under sex symbol, you're going to find a picture of Marilyn Monroe. She's presented in our culture, in our entertainment culture, as the sexual ideal. I want to tell you a little bit about Marilyn Monroe and her background. Here's her childhood highlights. She was born in 1927. Never knew her father. Never had any idea who her father was. When she was 4 years old, her mother, who had several mental illness episodes, was officially diagnosed with schizophrenia and placed in an institution, and she was placed in foster care. Marilyn Monroe was. Norma Jean. She was in out of various homes as a young kid, but the first time she was sexually abused was when she was 7. She was then placed in an orphanage at 8 years old. Same year, she was placed under the guardianship of her mother's friend, but her mother's friend left her in the orphanage for another year before she took her into her home. She was sexually abused by her mother's friend's husband when she was 10, then moved out of the house to live with her guardian's aunt at 11 years old. And things were relatively stable there for a few years until the aunt got sick and she was forced to move back into her abuser's home at 15. Hardly a year of her childhood went by without some life-altering, horrific trauma in it. Nothing. In an interview, she talks about getting into acting, and she describes her own childhood, and she says, "I didn't like the world around me because it was grim. My foster families used to send me to the movies to get me out of the house, and I'd sit there all day and way into the night." And she, watching these movies, idealized the actresses and actors on the screen and decided that's where she could escape what she was being raised in. Her third husband, Arthur Miller, playwright, said that "You are the saddest girl I've ever met." Her adoptive/abusive family moved out of the state, and because of the rules in California at the time, she couldn't leave the state with them. So they were just going to send her back to the orphanage at 15 years old. Didn't have any other options unless the age of personal consent to get married in California at the time was 16. And so she married her next door neighbor, 21-year-old neighbor, in order to not go back to this orphanage. He applied to the military a few years later and was deployed into the Pacific for 2 years. She was alone again. Ended up getting divorced. No money, no nothing. 22 years old, she decided under a pseudonym to pose for some explicit photographs to make $50. A few years later, she got her big break in Hollywood, started to gain some notoriety and some fame, and a guy by the name of Hugh Hefner found those photographs, published them in the inaugural edition of his magazine, never asked her, never gave her any money, never nothing, but ended up establishing an empire based on using her without any regard, without any compensation. She's a consenting adult. She made those choices. She was paid The Christian sexual ethic is repressive. It's not harming anyone. Just let people be people. Let adults be adults. At 36 years old, Marilyn Monroe took an overdose of barbiturates and died. Most people speculate that she did it intentionally to commit suicide. All her life, she was treated like an object and consumed by the people around her. She had commitment, consent, and generosity taken from her. She was used by people that should have protected her. Her sexuality was commodified and turned into a consumer good. And people to this day think of her as a sex symbol and still consume her in that way, despite what we know about her life and her background and the tragedy of her childhood. I'm telling you this, and this is heavy. I'm telling you this because as dark as her story is, and as tragic as it is, there are countless people, mostly women, who have stories like that and end up using themselves and their bodies as a way of making a little bit of money, or a way of finding a little bit of acceptance, a way of finding a little bit of affirmation. I want to just give you a couple statistics. Statistically, we have 75% of the guys in this room engage in pornography on a regular basis. Statistically, many women do as well. Here's some of the statistics. Most of the stats around pornography have to do with its effect on the user, and they rarely figure out, well, what is its effect, or where do people that act in pornographic films come from? 3 times more likely to be a victim of child sex abuse and end up in pornography. 3 times more likely. 2 times more likely to have lived in poverty. 5 times more likely to have lived in foster care. 5 times more likely to have experienced domestic violence. 3 times more likely to have been the victim of sexual abuse as adults. Higher rates of depression and mental illness. And when people dismiss Jesus' sexual ethic, the Bible's sexual ethic around consent and commitment and generosity, saying it's repressive, it's backward, it's puritanical, I think that there's a couple questions we should ask. First of all, what do you mean by the Christian sexual ethic? Let's talk about that, because I think sometimes there are people who have presented ideas as Christian, as biblical, that aren't. We'll talk about that in just a second. But secondly, here's a question for us. Have the human strategies, have the human ethics, have the human notions around sexuality really made life better for everyone? Especially women and children? Is what we see in our world really progress? Has our way contributed to human flourishing? Because here's some things we have to keep in the back of our minds. What if the sexual liberation that we see in someone is actually hiding sexual brokenness? What if we judge someone's promiscuity, but it's actually masking their pain? What if those people we chose to love, instead of consuming them or judging them? Because those are the 2 responses Christians have to the world. Sometimes while they're doing the same things themselves. They consume them and they judge them, sometimes simultaneously. Louise Perry is a non-believing feminist, wrote a book a few years ago called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Of course, the sexual revolution discussing things that happened in the late 50s, mid-60s, and on, just changing sexual norms. She writes, I'm going to propose an alternative form of sexual culture. Listen to what she says. One that recognizes other human beings as real people, invested with real value and dignity. She says it's time for a counter-revolution. Sounds like something the Bible says. That every human is inherently embedded with a sense of dignity and worth because they are created in the image of God. And this, she goes on to write, in order to change the incentive structure, we would need a technology, a way, a means that discourages short-termism in male sexual behavior, protects the economic interests of mothers, and creates a stable environment for the raising of children. And she says, and we do already have such a technology, even if it's old, clunky, prone to periodic failure. It's called monogamous marriage. Commitment. commitment, consent, and generosity. What people have been talking about for centuries that are believers in God. And it's incredible to me that a non-believing feminist is coming back around to these conclusions because she's seen the results of our choices play out in society. So what do we do? What do we do? All right, Patrick, that's heavy. I did not want to sit through that. I get it. I did not want to hear you say those words. I get it. I did not want to feel those things. I get it. So what do we do? Here's the message a lot of people got around sexuality in the church. And I've heard this stuff with my own ears, okay, having grown up in it. A lot of girls were told, have you ever heard the chewing gum or the rose petal analogy? Some of you women have sat through presentations where someone pulled out a piece of chewing gum, chewed it all up, and said, now, does anybody want this chewing gum? Everybody's like, no, of course not. And they said, that's you when you mess up sexually. You're a disgusting old piece of chewing gum. This is true. Or, here's a rose. Every time you mess up sexually, you're plucking off a petal of that rose. Who wants this ugly old stem? Nobody. Nobody wants that, and that's what you are when you mess up. That's what was taught, sometimes is being taught, to young women. And sometimes what's being taught to young women is if boys mess up, it's your fault because you weren't modest enough. Yeah. Listen, those well-intentioned, well-meaning lies. Those are lies. The people who propagate lies like that spread brokenness and confusion. I know they don't mean to, but I want you to know that if you have messed up sexually, you are not a disgusting piece of chewing gum or a rose without any petals. That's not who you are in the eyes of God. Nothing about your inherent worth and dignity and value has changed one bit. Because you were created in the image of God. And nobody, no one, no behavior can take that away. Your value is still your value. Nothing has changed. Lots of boys were told, this was the gym teacher, doing the sex talk. Lots of boys were told, never, ever, 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 ever think about it. Don't really ask questions about it. Whatever you do, never, ever, 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 ever mess up. And if you mess up, you should feel ashamed of yourself. That was the sex talk. Whether or not it was meant that way, that a lot of boys kind of inherited, I don't think Jesus would imply that. I think we can learn from Jesus a lot about how he interacted with people with sexual brokenness, because there's several stories. The woman at the well, John 4. The woman caught in adultery, John 8. Men and women in prostitution that gathered around him. We can learn a lot from them, and never once in any of those stories did Jesus say, you're a disgusting, dirty old piece of garbage that needs to be discarded. Never once, never once. Matthew chapter 12, verse 20. I just love this verse when you're thinking about tough topics where there's a lot of inner turmoil and regret and confusion, where he's quoting quoting Isaiah, but he says, a bruised reed he will not break. And a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. If we feel like we're bruised and we're hurting and we're broken, Jesus is the person that we want to come to, because he is not interested in hurting us anymore. He's not interested in making us feel any worse than we already feel, because we feel pretty bad. A bruised reed he will not break. So let me give you two suggestions as we talk about how we deal with sexual morality, and we'll make these fairly quick. And then next week, we're going to talk about some specifics. But number one, I would suggest this, is that we really do need to deal with the heart of the problem. Matthew 15:19, for out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. For a lot of, I think it's probably fair to say, guys who struggle with things like pornography, they just feel terrible and guilty all the time, or they try to figure out ways to justify it in ways that it's okay, and they go through this kind of inner turmoil of logic and regret and shame. But sometimes, and I encourage anybody that's struggling with unwanted sexual habits, there's several really good resources, books out there. I encourage you to talk to people. One of them is a book called Unwanted by J. Stringer cannot recommend it highly enough. But what he writes is that sexual immorality is a problem, but it's not always the problem. This is important. It's a problem, but sometimes it's a symptom of something deeper going on in the heart. Something has gone awry inside. Sometimes people are desperate for affirmation. Sometimes people are distracting themselves from purposelessness. Sometimes people are looking for belonging. And we buy into the lie that we'll find this long-term good at the end of this short-term evil. And that road never leads to good. It never leads to good. So dealing with our sexual brokenness, I think, means taking the time to address other factors in our hearts. But the second thing I would suggest, just broadly, is we need to let Jesus deal with our heart. The whole thing was that we couldn't fix ourselves. So Jesus promised that he would do it for us. That's the whole thing. So I know some people are trying to well, I'm going to right the ship. I'm going to pull out of the nosedive. I'm going to make it happen through sheer strength and willpower. And Jesus says you can't. You've never been able to. You have to let me heal your heart. Matthew 13:15. For this people's hearts has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn. And look at this promise. I would heal them. That's what we want. That's what we want. I want to wrap up with this. I think Shark Week was a week or two ago. Discovery Channel, Shark Week. It was fun, right? Wouldn't you like to get in the water and swim with those sharks? Andy Casagrande is one of the cameramen. He's a cinematographer, but he's one of the ones that gets in there, swims around with a great white, so all those documentaries we see that are right up close, these sharp teeth, these massive animals, he's in there with them. Somebody asked him one time, hey, what do you do if one of these sharks, these great whites, gets aggressive? How do you handle it? Because he's still got all his limbs somehow, despite doing this. He goes, how do you handle it? And he said, oh yeah, it's easy. Swim toward it. And the person is like, what? Yeah, swim toward it. And they're like, well, what in the world is swimming toward a great white shark that wants to eat you alive? How is that going to help? And he says, well, two things. One, it kind of confuses it because they're not used to that behavior. They're not sure what to do. But secondly, if you try to swim away, you're toast. Swimming towards it at least gives you a fighting chance because they are faster than you. He says, swim toward it. I believe with sexual brokenness, most of us have run away from it as far as we can in terms of not fleeing it, but trying to forget about it, trying to ignore it, trying not to pay attention to it. And as painful as it is, there is hope and healing from turning and facing it. Facing it. These are the things I have done. These are the things that have been done to me. Where can I find hope from healing? Not by pretending it didn't happen, but by finding forgiveness and redemption promised by Jesus Christ. It's only through facing it. I think you'll surprise the sin, saying, whoa, what's going on here? But you can't outrun it. You can't outrun it. We're going to participate 3 more weeks talking about this topic, and I know it's heavy, and I know you feel like, I got to gear up for it every week, and it's embarrassing, and my kids are here. We've told you before that we've got opportunities for your younger kids to go do other things. I get that. But honestly, I don't think we should run from this conversation. If talking about it makes you squeamish, that's probably something you should examine. Why is that? Well, why is that something that we haven't been able to talk about? And why is it in the church we haven't been able to talk about it very openly or very graciously or very kindly? Next week, we're going to talk about Jesus and homosexuality. And then 2 weeks, Steve is going to talk about how Jesus interacted with people who were different and other. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with Jesus and gender.